Hi, I'm Kim Garnica. I'm here to talk to you today about Francois Gagny's differentiated model of giftedness and talent. This is the model I chose. I do think this is a quality model that is worth using in schools. All right, I'm first going to give you a little overview of DMGT and what it means and what some of the key features were. First of all, Gagny decided to split up and define giftedness and talented separately. He defined 4 innate gifts and 7 categories of talents. I will go into each of these topics a little more on the next slides. Gifted people need to develop their talents, is what he says, through motivation, training, support, and from some external factors. This is where I see schools and educators coming into play with this model. So that gifted students need our support to build those talents from their gifts. Motivation can be interpersonal or environmental. We'll get into that a little more as well. And then aptitude should be considered when we're identifying students, and I know that's a huge topic we're talking about in this class, is being able to identify students. So it's not just on their current performance or maybe performance on a single test, but what could they do if they were developed and if their talents were developed. Schools need instructions to appeal to both those gifts and talents to provide the best education we can for our students. The 4 types of gifts are here: the intellectual, creative, socio-affective, and sensory motor. So obviously a standardized test would not test for all of these, or just a plain IQ test would not test for all of these. So Gagny definitely proposed using more measures than just a standard IQ test when looking for our gifted students. Then these 4 gifts can be through motivation and through some teaching and education, can be developed into talents in these 7 categories. So we have academics, arts, business, leisure, social action, sports, and technology. And so students who show gifts in those previous areas can then use those gifts to develop talents in one of these 7 categories. I think one of the most interesting parts of this, or what jumps out to me the most as an educator, are those motivations. And so Gagny defines 2 forms of motivations: environmental or intrapersonal. This comes from a document that I have cited on my last page, but it is actually from a book by Gagny himself. But so our environmental factors are physical factors, culture, social, family, those kinds of things, our parents, our family, our peers, teachers, and schools. And then resources. So does your school have a program, and what kind of program is it? What kind of curriculum is offered? And so we'll talk about these when it comes to some of the benefits and maybe some of the drawbacks to this model. Interpersonal are more the student themselves, what their physical abilities are, or physical handicaps potentially, their temperaments and attitudes and all those kinds of things. So lots of motivations that can come to play. One of the big things that Gagny talks about, however, is that chance always plays a part. So on the larger picture, I kind of just took a clip here of it, but on the larger picture of this, both of these motivations are encased within chance, and we'll talk a little more about that again as we move on here. So advantages, or what I see as the advantages of this model for education, is that students are judged not merely on current performance. So we're not just looking for those high achievers right from the beginning, but we're looking on potential and aptitude in those areas of giftedness and talents, so that we can bring those talents out of them, and that's our job as educators. I do think that this model is culturally responsive and does cover a lot of bases. A wide range of gifts and talents are considered. So there are really no ethnic, gender biases, anything like that when we look at this. Now, the trick of this comes into having an educational program and having ways of identifying students that are not culturally biased in one way or another. So, of course, those things could come to play, especially when we consider that most teachers are middle class, white, and that not all of our students are that way. So there definitely is a part of education and schools that have to make sure that when we're identifying students, we are not being biased in that way. So the testing, however, is not just standardized. We can look at some project-based and performance-based types of measures that would help us identify our students with gifts. It does identify the top 10% is what is recommended. That is a lot of students. So some schools are 1 or 2%. So looking at top 10% of students to be potentially gifted is a large range of students. Now, Gagne does go on to say that probably only 1% of students will actually fully meet their potential based on some of those motivational factors and some other things like that. But I do see that as an advantage that a lot of students can be identified and can be worked with in that way. Also, I think as educators, one of the big things that we look at is what kind of influence can we have if a model just says someone is gifted and their potential is fully developed at the time of their birth, then what is the role of educators and schools in that? And I think that this model says that, yes, students might be gifted and have potential, but that needs to be brought out in them. And not only is it maybe parents and cultural arenas that can help do that, but absolutely schools and educators can have a play in that and can have a great influence on those students throughout their lives. Now, of course, I don't want to just mention the advantages. There are always some disadvantages. So the potential can be affected by chance. I think that is somewhat of a disadvantage, but that's life as we know it, kind of. So some of those chances that were mentioned is, does your gifted child live in an area that has the resources available to them? Does the school have a quality program? Is the school being efficient in making sure that they are being non-biased and those kinds of things? It also mentioned things like health. If one of your gifts is physical, then maybe if you have an accident or an injury or something like that could change that definitely could matter. This could also be things like family socioeconomics and some things like that. So definitely that potential can be affected by some factors there. Then one of the big things is that cultural values can influence what's considered valuable or what's considered a gift. So maybe you are incredibly gifted at playing an instrument or something like that, but if your family or your school or your culture does not value that and does not see that as something that's important, then that definitely could play a part in whether or not your potential could be met there. So that's a disadvantage. I mean, that's again something that schools would need to work to make sure that they are valuing all of the gifts of all of their students. Then another thing that I read about in this one and I thought was kind of interesting is that gifted underachievers could be not considered or could be kind of left out under this model. So we know, and we've all can probably think of students that were very gifted, very intelligent, very had lots of potential, but that for one reason or another were underachievers. They just were not motivated, maybe not motivated at home or by the school system to fulfill those talents and to really live up to their potential. And this model does not necessarily provide a lot of considerations for those students. So in conclusion, I think that there are some drawbacks to this model. However, it is a very inclusive definition of giftedness, definitely leaves a lot of potential for educators to play a part in encouraging and developing the talents of those students. And I even think some of those drawbacks that we discussed could be affected by a great gifted program and teachers that really care and really make connections with those students. It has a realistic approach, I think, to identifying students, and is not necessarily just about where that child is now, but really sees how we can develop students and think about their future, not just about where they are currently. So thank you for your time. And here is just a little note about my citations at the end. So thank you very much for your time.